So this is Group 5, Wildlife Ecotoxicology of Pesticides by Taylor Richardson, Olivia Swanbeck, Ainsley Worth, Tyler Jessup, Cassius, and Norprecha. So pesticides' intended effects and research. Over the last 30 years or so, research has been increasing on the effects of pesticides and what they do to plants, animals, and their surroundings. Pesticides are made to kill organisms that are harmful to farming or uh, livestock. Examples would be, corn, uh, tomatoes, wheat, hay and stuff like that, or cows and pigs. They're there to inhibit pests from harming your crops or your yield. Thus, it would overall increase your yield. Um, the research done over the last 30 years or so increases information or includes information about the physical aspects or effects that it changes, whether it is physical like effects that you can see on them. It could be they have changes to adapt them to surviving that certain pesticide, to um, increase their ability to uh, live under these certain conditions. It could also be things like, oh, they have an extra leg or stuff like that, things that you can see with the naked eye, whereas your genetic aspects or effects that were researched and obtained during that 30 years or so is the different cycles of the body that are changed. That can be the different systems within the body. It can also be, your genetic structure that's passed on. So you could have ancestors down the road that would have been killed by a pesticide, whereas now they are surviving it due to an increased toxicology immunization. The genetic effects also increase the amount of testing and research that need to be done so that advancements can be made to continuously target these different bugs or organisms.
Pesticides have had some major unintended effects on individuals. Some examples are neurotoxicity, endocrine disruption, immunotoxicity, and developmental toxicity, which all lead to mass death and or population decline. The decline of the population will lead to changes in food sources as well as changing the habitat, which both directly affect the ecosystem. Some examples are in birds. They had impaired learning, foraging, and chick rearing, as well as thinner eggshells and reproductive failure. Bees have had behavior and metabolism changes, memory failure, decreased colony size, and other unknown factors that do affect the ecosystem as a whole.
Population levels effects of pesticides. Population is defined by all organisms in the same species who tend to live in a certain geographical spot. In this case, our populations would include the wildlife, and this is such things as mammals, birds, reptiles, amphibians, fish, invertebrates, and plants. As we know, pesticides can severely affect a population, and some examples are listed below. Mammals can have increased infection rate, and that can lead to increased mortality. Birds can have eggshell thinning, which leads to population decline. Reptiles can have reproduction failure, which includes affected population perimeters. Amphibians can have immunotoxicity, which can lead to population decline. Fish can have altered metabolisms, which can lead to mass deaths. Invertebrates can include neurotoxicity, and that can lead to immortality incidents, and plants can have impaired photosynthesis, and that can lead to impaired phytoplankton. As though we can see that it has some effects, but this is just a couple of them. They can have many effects that can lead to life-threatening problems. So overall, pesticides can control the population in many ways, and it's usually not for the good, it is for the worse, because it can lead to things such as death and other things.
An ecosystem is a community of organisms, of living organisms in an environment. A community is kind of like a smaller ecosystem, where there only needs to be at least two species of living organisms in an area that usually interact. Aquatic ecosystems are those that are most affected by pesticides because the pesticides do damage to both the organisms living in the water and those that are on land. And it affects all forms of life present in the ecosystem. Pesticides also disrupt the nutrient cycles in the ecosystem, which winds up affecting all organisms in that ecosystem because they all have processes that interact and affect each other, such as like predation and reproduction, mainly those that use plants to help do so. And pesticides overall decrease the amount of diversity of organisms in an environment. Once pesticides begin to affect the plants, it takes the whole environment into a downward spiral. For instance, insects that use those plants for food no longer get the same nutrients or can't use the plants for things like creating homes or keeping their offspring alive, protected, and healthy. And consequently, parasites also become more prevalent with the lack of nutrients in an environment because it allows them to have a wider range of hosts, which can then lead to them spreading more diseases in a ecosystem and leading to more deaths because animals don't have any way to protect themselves from it. And with more deaths in the ecosystem, it just takes sources of food away from whatever organisms use those for food. So all predators of some type of organism suffer from that.
The effects of global change on pesticide consequences. Pesticides are directly and indirectly impacted and influenced by global change. Global change increases warming and changes precipitation, which then changes spatial distribution and alters biotransformation. The change in spatial distribution and altering biotransformation leads to pesticides. Global change could increase unintended pesticide effects because of climate change. An example would be a lower pesticide residue is left on crops, which then makes farmers have to spray pesticides more often when there's a lower residue, which would cause farmers to go through more pesticides and pay more for pesticides.
Microevolution is evolutionary changes in a species over a short period of time. So it's been found that long-term pesticide effects take longer to wear off in species with long generation times, which makes sense that for species with shorter time periods of generations, the microevolution is a lot faster, and so those species can recover and develop the tolerance to the pesticides a lot faster. And this has been seen especially with species such as like freshwater microalgae, lady beetles, and green lacewing. There's currently not a lot of research and information on the degree that resistance contributes to regeneration. But there is also restoration from recruiting immigrating individuals. So if a species moves into an area, then they will have a lot better time coping to the pesticides. In other situations, just reducing pesticide application has been the most beneficial in restoring the biodiversity of a species. In lots of countries, there have been efforts to move from really strong pesticides to more modern compounds, and this can improve the situation, but they still have been seen to be pretty problematic. And then climate change is also going to affect the spatial distribution of pesticides, as well as the effect of pesticides on species. For example, higher water temperatures and changes in precipitation can make pesticides more potent. And one specific study predicts increased mortality, reduced genetic diversity, and a declining population growth rate when combining climate change with the pesticides. There's a lot of need for research to link direct and indirect effects of pesticides on increasing biological complexity, and also more research is needed to identify factors of climate change that would combine together and further increase the potency of pesticides.